The great white pelican is a familiar bird, a symbol of the African lakes, where it cruises gleaming in the sunshine. This flock is paddling round its breeding place, a tiny island in the center of a remote lake called Shala, in the Rift Valley of Ethiopia. In 1970, when this film was made, very little was known about the species. Its breeding behavior in particular was a mystery. When the island was discovered, another question immediately arose. Why did the birds spend so much time flying from their lake across a high mountain ridge? And where were they going? The ridge beside the lake stands 1,000 meters high. Every day during the breeding season, thousands of pelicans cross the mountain range. During an arduous season of research, two scientists discovered the reason for the birds' daily journey along the route they called the Pelican Flyway. Theirs was the first boat ever on Lake Shala. They were an American biologist, Emil Urban, and a celebrated African ornithologist, Leslie Brown. They discovered Pelican Island and its colony of 5,000 breeding pairs of great white pelicans. Perhaps there should have been a clue in the name of the lake. In the local language, Shala means pelican. But no one had realized before that the birds bred on Lake Shala. The island lies 15 kilometers offshore, usually hidden in the heat haze. It's protected by sudden storms that come sweeping out of the mountains. Urban and Brown had to get a reliable boat before they could learn the island's secrets. Emil Urban was professor of biology at Addis Ababa University. Leslie Brown lived far away outside Nairobi. Lake Shala wasn't easily accessible to either of them, but they shared an enthusiasm for great white pelicans. Brown regularly flew up from Kenya so that they could visit the island together. What intrigued them most was why the pelicans had chosen Lake Shala. It has no big fish in it, and several thousand pelicans need a great deal of fish. The answer seems to be that the lonely island gives them complete security from human interference. They built their hide before the pelicans returned to nest so that the birds could get used to it. When they climbed into it for the first time, an astonishing sight met their eyes beyond the tattered canvas screen. More than 2,000 pairs of pelicans nesting in an area about 50 meters square. Some of the birds were sitting on eggs, while others had tiny chicks. Yet others had young nearly as big as themselves. At close range, the noise of the colony was deafening. Urban and Brown now had a unique chance to study the breeding behavior of the great white pelican at close range. Slowly, after many days in their cramped hide, they began to understand the bird's behavior. What at first seemed just an unruly crowd soon became a series of individual dramas. The two observers had to invent a new vocabulary to describe what they saw. They called the principal characters knobbers. That's a male knobber on the right with a yellow face. The pelicans grow a fatty knob at the base of the beak when they're in full breeding condition and keep it for about 4 days after mating. They're colourful birds, right down to the orange nail at the tip of their beaks. The females' faces are either intense orange or pale pink. Once they'd realized which sex was which, Urban and Brown could start working out the details of their behavior. A party of male knobbers displaying together were warming up before they began wooing the females. Brown called this a group knobber display. He and Urban named the next technique the strutting walk. The courting couple stroll through the colony with an exaggerated gait. The male, the larger bird, always follows the female, though he sometimes has to flap his wings to keep up with her. Mating usually follows some time later when one male has prevailed over his rivals. Nest building starts after the pair is established. The male scoops out a hollow with the flexible beak that he otherwise uses for fishing, and then collects the nesting material. Sometimes he picks up only a single blade of grass or a small bunch of twigs. He presents it all to his mate in a disordered heap. She tucks it in under her breast. The finished nest is a shallow scrape in the ground, deep enough to hold 1 or 2 eggs. Although they're large, heavy birds, great white pelicans are remarkably light on their feet. If they weren't, a lot of eggs would get broken. A female often uses one large webbed foot to cover the egg as she incubates it. Their eggs are vulnerable. Kites come to the island to scavenge for scraps of fish or dead chicks. The Egyptian vulture is a predator on the lookout for unattended eggs. The vulture is closely followed by a pair of sacred ibis who benefit from its leavings. Some vultures carry an egg away to a quiet spot where they can break it open. Fish eagles are principally predators on live fish, but young ones especially often turn to scavenging. They're regular visitors to the island in search of scraps and carcasses. A juvenile stands little chance of success against competition from an adult fish eagle. The ibis stand by more in hope than expectation. The kite has found the corpse of a large young pelican, and the ibis cleans up the grass where a vulture broke an egg. Many birds that nest in dense colonies defend their nests fiercely against intruders. Brown and Urban noted that the pelicans were completely impassive. They sat tight on their eggs, but they showed no other response to strangers. Most of the eggs hatched out successfully, though it was difficult to see the tiny chicks. They have no covering of down. In the heat of midday, the parents spread their wings to shade them from the sun. The 2 watchers in the hide recorded for the first time the details of life in a pelican nursery. Old legends said that pelicans feed their chicks on blood pecked from their own breasts. Brown and Urban noticed that the chicks often peck at the blood-red spot at the tip of the parent's bill, which may be how the story began. The chick's pecking stimulates the parent to open its bill and release food. At about 3 weeks, the chick's appetite seems to be insatiable. The parents can bring enough fish for only 1 offspring. Any second chick usually dies at this stage. The young birds can shuffle about, but they don't move very far from the nest. Then, at a month old, they form up into what are called pods, creches containing chicks all of the same age. The parents may have to collect their chicks at feeding times if the security of the pod outweighs their hunger. all these young pelicans eat fish broken up and partly pre-digested by their parents. This was one of the great mysteries of the pelican colony on Lake Charlotte. The lake contains no fish big enough to be worth catching. Brown and Urban wanted to know how the birds obtained the 2 tons of fish needed to feed the colony every day. In the 5-month nesting season, they would need 300 tons of fish, but none of it can come from this lake. There are other birds as well as pelicans nesting on Lake Charlotte, but they don't have the same feeding problems. Their breeding colonies are on 2 rocky islets not far away. Urban and Brown named them Sacred Island and Abdium Island. The species that nest on these upthrusts of basalt don't depend on catching fish. Sacred Island was named after the sacred ibis that monopolize its rocky pinnacles at nesting time. These are the birds that visit Pelican Island to feed on scraps left by the Egyptian vultures. The absence of fish from Lake Charlotte causes them no problem. An ibis's long beak is adapted for picking and probing, enabling it to eat a wide-ranging diet from scraps of carrion to insects and crustaceans buried in sand or mud. The birds fly across to the mainland to find their food. So do the Abdium storks nesting on the dramatic basalt columns of Abdium Island. Abdium storks were named after the Egyptian naturalist who discovered the species. Like ibis, they don't depend on fish. They catch frogs and grasshoppers to feed their young, so the lack of sizable fish in Lake Charlotte doesn't trouble them. The main reason for the absence of fish in this beautiful lake seems to be the steepness of its shores. It plunges abruptly to a depth of 250 meters, so that there's virtually no shallow, fertile shore where fish can feed and spawn. There is one shallow area visited occasionally by a few pelicans. They don't fish there because the lake's endemic minnows, which are very common, are too small. The tiny fish, a couple of centimeters long, are perfect prey for grey-headed gulls and white-winged black terns, but are of no interest to a great white pelican. Gulls stand in the shallows waiting for the minnows to swim by. Cormorants normally hunt larger prey. They use Charlotte's only shallow beach as a place to rest and preen. The little fish often form shoals near the surface, and that's when the terns begin to feed. A solitary pelican ignores them as they fish all round it. Nevertheless, the Charlotte pelicans must find quantities of fish somewhere every day of their lives. After weeks of watching the birds on Pelican Island, Emil Urban and Leslie Brown pieced together the whole extraordinary story of their fishing expeditions. It begins at about 10 o'clock every morning when parties of pelicans take to the air. First, they fly 4 or 5 kilometers out into the lake and settle on the water. There they form into flotillas, 20 or 30 strong. From the island they appear as a hazy white line. A mountain ridge is still a good way beyond them. By this time the morning sun is heating up the air. A column of dust spiraling up hundreds of meters on the distant shore is the signal the first fishing party has been waiting for. Such an upcurrent can lift them over the 1,000-meter mountain that lies between them and a lake where they know they can find abundant food. Before they can make use of the air currents, they still have a long way to fly across the lake. The formation wavers against the mountain backdrop as its members gain the first of the lift. Far behind them on the lake, a fresh party forms up. New groups will take off at roughly 20-minute intervals throughout the day until the air cools in the late afternoon and the flying has to cease. The mood of Charla changes all the time. It can be like glass one minute and flecked with spray the next when a sudden wind comes rushing out of the mountains. The Pelicans are looking for rising air to provide them with lift. In a flat calm, the mirage sometimes appears to double their numbers or to dissolve some of the birds in mid-air. Suddenly they're away, beginning the long soaring climb along the lower slopes of the peak. They've nearly 1,000 meters still to climb, rising in tight turns within the column of uprushing air known as a thermal. A second party follows them down the shore. Emil Urban and Leslie Brown were on the brink of their great discovery. Great white pelicans are among the most efficient and graceful flyers in the world of birds. Their ability on the wing is all the more remarkable in view of their great weight and their clumsiness on the ground. The first birds from Pelican Island have flown over the mountain crest. 15 kilometers away is the object of their long flight, a second Great Lake. It's all downhill from here on. The lake beyond the peak is called Abiata, and it's full of big fish. The pelicans begin the long glide down to their target area. The lake level fluctuates from year to year. In one corner, it's flooded some huts and a small wood of acacia trees. Among these trees, 2,000 pelicans can catch all the fish needed by the breeding colony on their distant island. The flooded woodland attracts a wide range of African water birds. Beyond the feeding pelicans, a snowstorm of flamingos falls from the clear blue sky. Cormorants have established themselves in the outer fringe of the wood. The place is a natural hunting ground for fish eagles. Their cries echoing across the water have been called the voice of Africa. Flamingos filter their food from the water, catching mostly diatoms, algae and brine shrimps, but the other birds come here to catch fish. The water in Abiata is chemically almost the same as in Shala. Both are soda lakes and strongly alkaline. The reason that Abiata has so many fish is that it's very shallow, much warmer, and thus more fertile. For a Goliath heron, it's an easy place to feed. This pelican didn't come from Shala. It's the other African species, the pink-backed, smaller and less colourful. The marabou stork is not strictly a fishing bird. It's an opportunist watching for the chance to take another bird's catch. The Goliath heron has caught 2 fish at once, and the marabou waits to see if it'll drop one of them. A wood stork uncovers crustaceans by stirring the bottom with its foot. The marabou has found the fish that the Goliath heron dropped. Now it's spotted a grey heron fishing, but its prey is well and truly speared. Unlike the great white pelicans from Shala, pink-backed pelicans nest in trees. They never breed at Abiata, but they perch in the tangled branches of the flooded woodland, roosting and squabbling between fishing expeditions. Pinkbacks fish alone. Judging by the difficulty it has in swallowing its catch, it's probably a young one. An adult cormorant knows how to turn a fish head first before swallowing it. Unlike flying, fishing is something birds have to learn. For a young fish eagle, Lake Abiata is a good place to practice. But the eagle has a rival, another of its own kind. It takes its catch to a tree, but it doesn't feel safe until it's driven the opposition away. Such competition between eagles is a matter of status rather than necessity. There's plenty of fish here for all the birds. The great white pelicans from Charlotte fish as a team. A cormorant follows them, alert for anything that escapes the net. On spidery legs, a black-winged stilt stalks the shallows. Egyptian geese add their raucous honking to the symphony of bird sounds. Black-tailed godwits find their food by digging in the rich bottom mud. Pin-tailed drakes come to Ethiopia to escape the European winter. They upend for food near a smaller group of pin-tailed ducks. Much of the abundant food from Lake Abiata goes towards feeding young families. Darters nest in dead trees beside a noisy group of cormorants. A floating lump of peat makes an uneasy perch for a bird escaping the turmoil of the breeding colony. The shores of Lake Abiata are an ever-changing pattern of sound, movement and light, as each species follows its own ends among the complex community. Among the noise and activity, a fleet of white pelicans go fishing in the shallows. They work together, swimming in formation, often forming a circle around the fish. They dip their beaks simultaneously, as if at a signal. This panics the shoals, breaking them up so that individuals can be caught or driving them into shallow water. Watching large groups in action, Urban and Brown noticed that only a few individuals succeed each time. They could see which they were by watching for birds throwing their heads back to swallow a fish. After they've fed, all the fishing birds bathe, working the lake's bitter water among their plumage. Feathers that have been held close to their bodies for buoyancy are now opened up to let the water reach the skin. When washing is complete, the feathers must be dried, creamed and oiled. Maintenance of their plumage is important to all birds, but for the great white pelicans it has a special significance. They're preparing for the return flight over the mountain back to their hungry chicks. The cormorant has only to fly to its treetop nest. The pelicans have to travel nearly 30 kilometers to their island in the middle of Lake Charlotte, climbing 1,000 meters on the way. Their plumage must be in first-class condition. Urban and Brown couldn't be quite certain, but it seemed likely that most of the pelicans spent 24 hours fishing at Aviata before they made the return trip. Now they're ready to start the journey with as much as 1.5 kilos of fish to carry, in addition to their 12 kilos of body weight. The first birds are climbing steeply to look for a thermal that will help them on their way home. They bank round away from the lake. The strongest upcurrents will be found over the land behind the flooded woodland. One group has already gained some height and turned toward the distant mountains. Ahead of them is another formation looking for upcurrents along the shore. Skeins of returning pelicans fly low for 15 kilometers across Lake Aviata and then join the aerial escalator at the foot of the mountain, just as they did on the outward trip the previous day. With 500 meters still to climb, they catch their first glimpse of home. From the top of the thermal, they straighten out and set course for Lake Shala, ahead of them beyond the crest. As usual, Pelican Island lies shrouded in heat haze. Some of the returning birds, crossing the mountain ridge by means of thermals, have climbed far higher than they need. They have plenty of time to lose their extra altitude. Now the island is 8 kilometers ahead. The birds have only to glide in a straight line. Although they're still very high up, they adopt a landing posture, their wings in the stalling position and their feet down, acting as air brakes. From time to time, they close their wings briefly to lose height more quickly. Though they are graceful in flight, they're very heavy birds. The wind whistles through their feathers as they come into land. The discovery of the breeding colony by Emil Urban and Leslie Brown answered one question but posed a number of new ones. In particular, why the birds regard the island as the only place in Ethiopia safe enough for breeding. The young pelicans recognize their own parents almost before they touch down. They chase them, begging for food. The adults try to lead them to a quiet spot in the colony, away from other hungry beaks. The large young, about 2 months old, are ravenously hungry. At this stage, they're fed only once every 24 hours. Soon they'll have to fish for themselves. Already some parents seem reluctant to feed them at all. All the time, more birds are returning from Lake Abiata. As more and more adults return from fishing, the island becomes ever more crowded and turbulent. The adult regurgitates partly digested fish into its pouch for the young to scoop out. It's surprising that the parents aren't injured. as their hungry young push sharp beaks far down their throat. Large juveniles often go through the motions of feeding from each other while the parents are away. They're at a crucial stage in their life. The adults will soon be unable to fetch enough food to satisfy them, and they'll have to find their own. First, they must develop the use of their wings. They begin flapping before their flight feathers are fully grown. The movement exercises and develops their breast muscles. The wind off the lake stimulates them to greater efforts and gives them their first experience of lifting off the ground. It's an exhausting time for the young pelicans when they burn up energy as fast as their parents can replace it. By surviving to join the pod as chicks, they'd passed the first hurdle. Now, learning to fly, they're approaching the second. About 3/4 of them will succeed. They're just over 2 months old. In about another week, they'll be abandoned by their parents and left to fend for themselves. For the next few days, they'll be practicing takeoffs and landings in the strong wind that blows across Lake Charlotte every afternoon. By morning, the wind has gone and the air is baking hot. It's flat calm, and very soon the air currents will be building up to carry the birds over the mountain to Abiata. Off Pelican Island, a group of well-fledged youngsters assembles, preparing for their first long flight. One or two of them are still demanding to be fed, but even if their parents indulge them, it'll be for the last time. From now on, if they want food, they'll have to go and find it for themselves. Younger chicks in the water are often those who are still learning to fly. The water is a forgiving landing place for beginners. The parents seem able to find their chicks wherever they are. The full-grown young birds are ready to leave. Although a few of them are plainly still following their parents, most seem to have merged with the flock. Flying is instinctive, but the tactics for crossing the mountains need to be learnt from experienced adults. The barrier is too high for them to fly over it without assistance from the invisible thermals, and finding them can't be left to trial and error. Only a very small proportion of the young birds travel with the adults to fish at Abiata. Most of them, having used the experience of their elders to show them how to escape the lake on their first flight away from the island, will simply not come back. Neither Leslie Brown nor Emil Urban, who unraveled the story of Lake Charlotte's pelicans, could say where they go. The birds won't return to the island to breed until they're at least 3 years old. Where they spend the years in between is still a mystery. The rising air currents along the distant mountains are beckoning now. For young and old, it's time to be going. The young birds with dark wings fly confidently among the adults, gliding close to the surface as if they'd been doing it for years. Ahead lies the great mountain which they must all cross. Beyond it, for the first-year birds, wait 3 years in the unknown. Pelicans once bred over most of Eastern Europe, though now they're found only in the Danube Delta in Romania. From here, and from Greece and Turkey, these northern birds migrate in winter to join the African population. It's widely assumed that they wander in Africa and the Middle East for 3 years before returning to their native countries to breed, and that all the Ethiopian birds return to Lake Shala. But nobody knows. For such a conspicuous bird, surprisingly little is known about the white pelican. Urban and Brown's pioneering work remains the principal source of information about their breeding. The pelicans of Lake Shala carry their secret with them, a secret as tantalizing as their flickering shapes melting in the mirage.